You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Caylan Ford is a Jill of all trades and a master of just about all of them. She is a documentary filmmaker, writer, researcher, charter school founder, former political candidate, someone who is extremely well-read, has an interest and background in Chinese history, international affairs, international human rights law, with a large part of her life dedicated to increasing access to anti-surveillance and censorship tools in nations like Iran, China, Myanmar, and elsewhere, working with civil rights lawyers, political dissidents, refugees, asylum seekers, a publisher in research on the repression of religious minorities in China, as well as publishing to a more general audience on the subject, co-producer of documentary films on the theme of religious and political persecution, censorship, forced labor, scapegoating, and mass persuasion under totalitarian regimes, with further interest in tuition-free classical charter school education, an author and speaker in such topics as culture, biopolitics, education, family and child care policy, post-liberalism, and the problems of political and philosophical evil, and somehow still has the time to be a mother of two. Caylan Ford is my guest in this episode, and yet in spite of that very long list of sundry and interesting accomplishments, we talk about almost none of that in this conversation. Rather, we focus on her experience running for political office and the efforts to cancel her. A lot of people have been canceled, but very few, in my opinion, are quite as insightful or reflective about it as Caylan. So I thought it was an awesome opportunity to get to pick the brain of someone who has gone through the gauntlet and gained some wisdom and insight that's worth sharing with the rest of us. Now, I'll say, too, I consider myself to be someone who is very well-read, but in the course of this conversation, Caylan had a knack for bringing up books and authors that I actually have not had an opportunity to read. You can't see it on the podcast, but she visibly gasped when I acknowledged, no, I have not, in fact, read J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. In spite of that handicap, I think we had a very fruitful conversation. I certainly got a lot out of it, and I suspect you will too. So with all that, I give you my conversation with Caylan Ford.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
Caylan, I don't know that I have ever had a guest on in preparation for it, because usually when I get someone on this podcast, if I don't know a lot about them, I try to do what dive I can. If they've written a book, I try to read it. If they've, done interviews, I obviously try to listen to those. And it seems like the more I learned about you, the less I felt prepared. Not because I don't think there's things to talk about, but because there were just too many rabbit holes to go down. And so, if anything, I'm a little nervous in this conversation that I won't do a good job as a host trying to stick to the topic, which, broadly speaking, as I told you, is kind of about cancel culture, a topic I personally avoid in most cases. But when I have someone on who has a lived experience, who is also insightful, I think it's worth talking about. It's certainly an interesting, a political debate of today, if you will. So I want to start here. Could you just briefly sketch for the audience what was your experience in political foray with both cancel culture and what, or let me rephrase that. What were you accused of and what is the truth?
Okay, that's an interesting framing. So I decided in 2018 to seek political office at the provincial level in Alberta, Canada, which is where I grew up and was from. My intention there was I wanted to be involved in reforming education policy, and maybe we'll talk more about that later in the show a little bit. And my candidacy was going very, very well. I was in a very competitive constituency running against what was then the justice minister for the opposing kind of Democratic Socialist Party. And then a month...
You'll have to, and I'm sorry to interrupt so early, but we have a predominantly American audience here, and we're ignorant in all things, political parties outside. When you say Democratic Socialist, would that comport to like Bernie Sanders AOC, or does that have a different meaning, say, in Canada?
It's probably roughly analogous to that wing of the Democratic Party. Canada is a multi-party system, though, so the major political parties at the provincial and federal level tend to be a Conservative Party, a liberal party, which in the modern context usually means quite far to the left, I think, and an even further left party known as the New Democratic Party, whose constitution states that they're socialists, right? So I'm not using that as an unfair pejorative. That's their self-identification. They had been the ruling party in my province. A bit of a historical aberration. Alberta is usually pretty conservative, but the New Democratic Party, the NDP, had been ruling for 4 years, and that's the context in which I was running. So running against one of their cabinet ministers, so kind of a member of the executive, so to speak. For them, it was a must-win constituency, but polling data was showing that I was likely on track to flip that seat and to win it. And then a month before the election, a partisan organization that was founded by a former leader of the NDP. This is called Press Progress. Kind of like, I think Media Matters is maybe, is that am I thinking of the right thing? That's kind of maybe an American analogy. But this is an outlet that's actually run by an institution that is overtly partisan, founded by a former leader of the NDP to advance their goals. And they published a story claiming that in a private conversation 2 years earlier, I had expressed sympathy for white supremacist terrorism. And they published, I think, 4 short comments out of that private conversation. So they removed all of the actual context. And the actual context, I was not expressing sympathy for white supremacist terrorists, needless to say. So they removed all that context. They edited those statements even further without telling their audience they were doing so, in order to kind of change the psychological valence of the statements and remove important contextual clues. And then they repackaged it in this sort of incendiary framing right after the Christchurch mosque massacre, and suggested that I am sort of ideologically aligned with the perpetrator of that massacre, that I support violence, that I had threatened an innocent Muslim man, and was basically a white nationalist or a white supremacist, and calling for me to be removed from the ballot. And very quickly, this story gained traction on social media in particular, and I was forced to resign my candidacy. And that wasn't the end of it, because I think certain people might have thought that it's just expedient to get rid of someone who's attracting negative attention ahead of the election. But it almost had the opposite effect. It was almost like a concession that, yes, this person is guilty. And so the story remained very active in the press for a month thereafter. Almost every single day, there was a new media article saying that I had promoted extremism, sympathized with terrorists, implying that I maybe threatened violence, that I deserved complete public ostracism. I should be stripped of my party membership. I should be denied a media platform to defend myself. My friends were pressured to denounce me publicly. People tried to figure out who my other employers might be so that they could get me fired from every other job. I was the primary breadwinner for my 2 very young children, 11 months and 3 years. And and it really never let up. I think the frequency and intensity of the public denunciations dissipated, but never ended, I should say. So that was those are the basic lineaments of the story. Yeah.
I'm saying this not so much in way of comparison, but almost whatever the opposite of comparison would be, because the only air quotes cancel culture I've ever experienced was actually fired from the right, if you will. Someone who thought I was illegitimately Trumpy and contacted my employer. And thankfully, my employer essentially said, Josh has a First Amendment right to express these opinions. They didn't ask me to, but I put something on my website after that saying basically my opinions have nothing to do with my employer's opinions. But that was it. It was just one lone individual trying to get me in trouble, and that was all that happened. And so I think you've sketched very well what was presumably something that had, I'm sure the intensity didn't necessarily sustain itself the same for years, but for a long period of time, sustained pretty intense. We hear about these things all the time. A lot of us, I don't think, necessarily know someone who has had as personal or direct a relationship as you have. And so I'm wondering if you could just spend a little bit of time expressing the challenge that presented to you? I mean, you mentioned you're a primary breadwinner for your kids, but like, did this destroy friendships? What did this do to you as a person?
Um, well, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty devastating experience. I think cancel culture the mechanism works through there's a couple different components. On the one hand, you have the media or the social media shaming, right? So thousands of people, probably tens of thousands, participated in this kind of ritual whereby I was denounced, mocked, humiliated on social media. But then it also involves the element of appealing to people in authority to remove this person. So to fire them from jobs, to deplatform them, to take away their livelihood. And the first element of that itself is, I think, if you're a normal person who seeks a sense of sort of belonging as part of a community and wants to be understood by others, the first part of that is really a very devastating experience. The second part, where the institutions that you think should have your back capitulate before the mob and sort of throw you to them, that's a profound sense of betrayal. And it's a kind of, I think it causes a unique sort of suffering because it's not as easily intelligible when your friends and people you thought were friends so readily betray you and decide that your contributions are not worth the tiny bit of social capital that would take to stand up to a mob, right? To do what your employer did, for example. Yeah, I lost friends. I recall one of my closest friends said that her colleagues and her peer group had pressured her to denounce me. They said, if you invite Caylan to events, if you invite her to parties, we won't show up. And so they put pressure on her indirectly to denounce and disavow me, which she basically did. Relationships with even kind of extended family members were severely strained because it's difficult not knowing what people actually think of you, right? Was this person credulous? Did they actually believe some of the things that were said about me?
Right.
You tend to start just avoiding social situations because that's very uncomfortable ambiguity. I was told by numerous employers that they couldn't engage with me because I was a reputational liability. Charities didn't want me to participate for the same reason. Any cause I attached my name to, again, it would be a liability. And so I largely stopped doing a lot of the at least public facing international human rights advocacy that I had spent most of my life doing because I was no longer helpful, basically.
Mm-hmm.
That is also a very profound sense of loss. I think my general view is that insofar as we have any gifts or talents, they're not given to us merely for our own comfort or happiness or satisfaction. They're on loan almost. They're not necessarily merited, and they're given to us so that we might use them in service of what is good and just and right, that we can serve others. And that was the impetus for me to run for office. Dispositionally, I don't think I'm well suited to politics, but I felt I kind of had a social duty, as it were, to try to contribute to the common weal of my society and better it. And I found after I was canceled that I had no vehicle or opportunity by which I could use my gifts to serve others. I had been rendered completely useless. I couldn't work to support my own children. No one wanted to engage with me. No one would publish me for years because they were afraid of, the sort of the contamination, the reputational contamination that they would risk. And so it was a feeling of being rendered completely useless, and kind of then compounded by the sense that even people who know me, again, think that the contributions that I might have made were not worth speaking up for me or defending for me, right? So, the challenge there is, I think, human beings we're social creatures, and our perception of reality of ourselves requires a measure of social affirmation, right? Like we like even the way that we mentally conceptualize, say, the dimensions of an object, we habitually, without even realizing we're doing it, we consider it from the perspective of others to help us build a mental model of the thing. And so, as social beings, whose survival depends on social approbation and belonging, it's very threatening and it's very kind of discombobulating to feel that your own perception of your reality of who you are no longer matches the outside world's perception of who you are. This causes tremendous dissonance. And I think there's a couple ways that people might try to resolve that dissonance. You can try to persuade others of what you see as the truth, right? You can try to tell other people what you actually think, what you actually believe, what kind of person you are. You can try to set honest deeds against dishonest words and persuade them that way. Or you can internalize the world's perception of you and conclude, like, yeah, I must be a worthless, bad person who deserves ostracism, who should be quarantined from society, who would be better off dead. Or you can try the more stoical or philosophical approach and draw a separation between the interior and the exterior world, and rely entirely on your own internal sense of discernment. But that requires a tremendous amount of spiritual stamina. And so what's more likely to happen is I think a person may oscillate between all three, and that's certainly what I did.
I'm wondering if this fits in your framework, though, because what springs to mind is there's a fourth option that I see very, very frequently, which is a degree of the internalization of victimization of an individual who sees themselves not necessarily always unfairly, but sees themselves as a victim of this and therefore reorients their entire political ideology or how they approach the air quotes the other, the enemy. There's an entire cottage industry now on the right for combating cancel culture, even to the point that there are now some on the right who, whether they recognize it or not, appear, in my view, to be committing cancel culture, in the name of somehow stamping out the left. That this is something that you're quite right. We are social creatures, so I think we have a degree of cognitive dissonance that's not only painful, but who knows where it's going to take you if this is if this is turned up to an 11. An individual who I say on this podcast quite often, Stoicism is a wonderful philosophy. I just don't think you can build an entire civilization upon it because there's not that many people volunteering for Stoicism. You almost need something else with a little bit more, let's say, mass appeal to it.
Yeah, Stoicism is the philosophy of emperors and slaves. It's not.
Yes.
It's not the philosophy for the middle. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. And so the reason I bring that up, and another reason I wanted to talk to you about this, what I often call the low-hanging fruit on the right of cancel culture. There's a lot of good stories, a lot of ways in which I think we can rightly rail against the left. But you strike me as an individual who not only experienced in a high degree, because one thing I do abhor that I think the right is doing more and more that I never did like about the left is the degree to which they want to see themselves as a victim. Now, there's an element to that I think is entirely fair and truthful. I think there's also an element to that in which it seems so odd to me the degree to which people revel in identifying themselves as a victim. The moment they feel that they've been shadow banned, if you will, maybe your content sucks. Maybe it's not because some dark overlord is trying to shut you down, if you will. But you were one who clearly went through the gauntlet and didn't appear, from what I can tell anyways, to have lost your soul, or at least came out at some point on the other side with an ability to see clearly the necessity of maintaining I'll just say, of maintaining one's soul. And so maybe this is a too broad a question. I hope this makes sense to you. But do you see that? Do you see in others that they've gone through a similar experience and it's actually darkened them? They're actually worse off for it in a way. It's not just that it's devastating and painful, but they've actually turned, they themselves have become corrupted by the process. And if so, what do you recommend to, God forbid, anybody who has to go through a gauntlet like you did? What keeps your head above water? What keeps you on the straight and narrow?
Your comments about the fourth option, yes, you're right. And I need to puzzle through this idea more of why is it that some people are attracted to the identity of victimhood? Because I think that I was grievously wronged, and I've filed a massive, potentially the largest defamation claim in Canadian history in response. So I think that I was objectively wronged, but I don't self-identify as a victim. So yeah, why is that some people are attracted to that identity or that status? I'll think more about that. Maybe we can come back. But I think certainly another of that option in how to respond to this is, you're familiar with the writings of René Girard?
Yes, I will say, just as a brief introduction, because you had mentioned that we could talk about him, and I'm more than happy to do so. Maybe because I'm too much of a Burkean, my natural prejudice to any French philosopher is to assume that I'm not going to like what they have to say, except for Montesquieu, of course. And the other problem with Girard is he is most closely aligned in my mind with Peter Thiel, the wealthy
Oh,
American
okay.
who's
Yeah,
funded
yeah.
Donald Trump and funded JD Vance, but even more
I
worse,
share
Carrie
your, I
Lake
share
and
your
Blake Masters.
skepticism of Peter Thiel, but no, I
Right.
don't think we can lay that at the feet of Girard. Yeah.
In all fairness, there are plenty of yahoos like, say, former President Woodrow Wilson that was a big fan of Edmund Burke. So with that brief introduction out of the way, I'm just going to say I am familiar with, I've not dipped my toes in as much as I should because I've had some poor reasoning, if you will, to stay away from him, but I probably need to check him out. But do continue.
Well, Girard has a single insight. By his own admission, he has one issue. He's written numerous books about it. I wonder sometimes if he himself finds his obsession tedious, and yet it kind of works. So one of the ideas for which he's best known is mimetic rivalry and how it produces the scapegoating mechanism or ritual, and the idea of sort of violence or sacrifice as being at the core of many human civilizations. So these are all related ideas, I should say. So mimetic desire is basically the idea that mimesis means like imitation. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but mimetic desire is sort of the idea that many of our desires are not actually things that originate from inside ourselves. We like to think they are, but what's more likely true in most cases is there are external models whose desires we emulate, we copy. So this is why you have trends in fashion, for example, or in home decor or whatever. It's why people often end up pursuing the same objectives. It's because they're emulating the desires of others, and thereby they enter into a rivalrous or competitive situation with others. And to simplify this quite grossly, one of the ideas that Girard elaborates is that when mimetic rivalry escalates to an untenable degree and risks devolving into a war of all against all, one way that this is temporarily resolved is through the scapegoating mechanism, which transmutes that war of all against all into a war of all against one. And in order for the scapegoating mechanism to work, it doesn't matter if the scapegoat is actually guilty or innocent, but you need complete unanimity that they are guilty. The belief has to be totally unanimous. And all of the sort of sins of the community, all of the social tension is sort of loaded onto the scapegoat. And through a cathartic ritual of the sort of exile or persecution or even murder of the scapegoat, the community is cleansed, or so it believes. And a sort of an ersatz or temporary social harmony is restored. I think this is a useful framework for understanding various aspects of cancel culture in some ways. But one of the things that Girard anticipates is that, again, in order for the ritual to achieve its magical effect, everyone needs to agree about the guilt of the scapegoat, even the scapegoat, him or herself. One of the areas where you see this very obviously manifest is in totalitarian show trials, right? So think the sort of show trials of the Soviet Union, where a huge amount of effort goes into extracting forced confessions or apologies. Similarly, the Cultural Revolution and the public struggle sessions in China, the forced apology is very important. So too in cancel culture. I faced like innumerable demands that I confess to my imagined thought crimes and apologize for them. And no one could ever say like what I was apologizing for, what intellectual error I had actually made. No one could articulate any actual harm that I was responsible for. I don't know who I was supposed to apologize to. And certainly the point was never restorative. It was never about apology as a means of sort of reestablishing social comity. It was about humiliation. And I think about the idea that the scapegoating ritual only works if I confess. And in this context, it's common for the person who is sort of being so accused to at some point throw up their hands and say, all right, fine, yeah, I really am the things you say I am. And I think you see a little bit of this on the right, where people are accused of being, let's say, toxic or racist or white supremacist. When those accusations are not true, if you keep going long enough, I think there's a certain contingent of people who will just eventually start embracing it and say, like, yeah, you're going to call me this anyway. Why don't I just become the demonic thing that you're accusing me of, right? So I think that's I can understand that propensity, to feel that you're being mistreated, you're being falsely accused, and to just say, okay, fine, you want me to be this wicked thing so badly, that's what you'll get. The pressure to there's I think an enormous pressure to either hate or to imitate the world when you feel wronged by it to this degree. And resisting those two paths and somehow being able to retain that stillness in your soul and the equanimity and the love of mankind, and to not hate those who you feel have wronged you, is an enormously challenging thing to do. I can share one anecdote that is maybe kind of weird, and I have not very practiced at articulating it.
Give it a shot.
So, coupled with, I'm not really a stranger to being lied about or facing feelings of injustice. Most of my life now, I've practiced a Buddhist meditation practice called Falun Dafa, which is very severely persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese state has devoted enormous resources, propaganda, security resources, to dehumanizing people who practice this and suppressing it through various coercive means, including abroad through transnational repression. So, this has been the backdrop to a lot of my life. So I'm not unfamiliar with it. But I remember one day the combination of these things. I was dealing with like a certain kind of, I won't go into details, but I was dealing with a sort of an escalation in challenges of transnational repression by the Chinese Communist Party, at the same time that I'm going through this experience of being like abandoned by my friends, having ostensible allies in the kind of conservative media ecosystem tell me that it's too risky to publish interviews with me, and I'm just like railing against their cravenness, and lack of passion for the truth. And also, by the way, the other part of the story is that the guy who leaked these private messages was basically a stalker. I had to get a permanent restraining order against him. His conduct was so bad that my province recognized a new cause of civil action, a tort of harassment. So it was like precedent-settingly bad harassment.
Wow.
That was the source that all the media knowingly colluded with. So, and he continued this campaign afterwards too. Like he tried blackmailing podcast producers that I would interview to stop them publishing interviews about me. He offered someone $10,000 to swear a false affidavit against me to try to get me held in contempt of court. He endless stuff. So I'm dealing with all of this. And I'm unemployable, and it's the stress of not knowing how I'll pay my bills. It was a lot. And so there's a particular mountain that I like to run away to get away from the world sometimes in the Rocky Mountains. And I went up there one day and I just sort of hike alone and try to clear my mind and get away from people. And I remember as I was hiking, I felt like, a profound isolation, loneliness, but also it was the sense of, the internal monologue was something like, I've tried so hard to resist hating people, to try to do good in the world, but alas, people, or so it seemed to me, don't actually care what's true, don't have the courage of their convictions, don't care what's good. They laugh it down, they mock it. To hell with them. And, why do I try so hard to preserve charity in my heart towards such people when they would, this is the feeling. And the kind of tension that I could feel inside myself, it felt like a real sort of spiritual battle. And then I realized suddenly, this is where you need to read Girard to make sense. Because I was thinking about Girard when I was like on this hike. How deep do you want to go here?
Feel free to go as deep as you like. This podcast is a hole with no bottom.
Okay. I think one of my interpretations of, in order for this conversation to be intelligible, we have to establish certain premises. One being, there are malevolent powers and principalities and spiritual forces at play in the world that are contending for people's souls. Do we accept that premise for the sake of argument?
Yes. Yeah, as a Burkean conservative, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
I know that I saw an interview where you were on a skeptics podcast, and so it was possibly a little bit different conversation trying to accept premises, but let's say we're on the same page there.
Okay. I think that one of the motives, let's say, of some of these, let's call it demonic, satanic forces that seek the ruin of souls, is that they don't believe that human beings are worthy of salvation, that they don't think we're worthy of being redeemed. This is part of the premise of like Milton's Paradise Lost, for example, right? This idea, why does God treat human beings as if they're so special, right? And devote so much care and attention to them, this sort of thing. So I realized suddenly that so much of what was occurring to me in my life was almost as if it was a test to see how far do we need to push you before you accept that premise that people aren't worth they're not worth compassion, they're not redeemable. At what point do you actually just say to hell with them? And I'd been pushed to that point here on this mountainside in the winter in the Rocky Mountains of saying like, yeah, they're not worth it. People can't be redeemed. And as soon as I recognized that, I thought, well, there's, I think, some little good part of me that was not wholly affected by this kind of welled up and just rejected it, having seeing clearly that I think that's what was going on here. And I said, no, I just refuse to give in to that. And part of that refusal is the recognition that I also am, I live a life that is full of error and stumbling and perplexity and confusion. And for all the bad that I do, I nonetheless always feel that this hand of grace is extended to me whenever I would reach for it. How can I then refuse that to other people when it's been offered to me so unrelentingly and unconditionally? And I realized that all of these things that I've been going through it's very much a kind of selective view of reality. Do you remember, are you a Lord of the Rings fan?
I have not read it, but I am. Yes, I know. Yes, you're. One would think. Yeah, I'm not. I came to my nerdiness later in life, and so I kind of bypassed some of those rights. The Chronicles of Narnia and Lord of the Rings. I need to get to them eventually. Oh, yeah. I like Tolkien and I like C.S. Lewis. I just have not delved into those particular books.
Okay. Well, I assume that much of your audience will be familiar, nonetheless, with the Palantir in The Lord of the Rings. The Palantir are seeing stones. And one of the characters, the the steward of Gondor, Denethor, has obtained a seeing stone, but its sort of match is in the possession of the Dark Lord Sauron. So by peering into the seeing stone, he's able to, he uses this largely for purposes of shoring up the defenses of his city, right? But he he's allowed to see, and it can't lie. It has to show true things. But Sauron ensures that what he is allowed to see is only the kinds of things that will fill his heart with despair. So the view is selective. He sees the might and the force of his enemies, and he sees destruction. He doesn't see cause for hope. And by this means, his mind was overthrown, and he succumbed to madness. And he was a very wise, noble, a very wise and noble man, from a very noble lineage. But he was overthrown by despair. And so I realized that that's kind of what was happening to me too, is that I was being given a very selective kind of false appearance, of reality, such that I was only seeing the bad in order to see at what point do I just succumb and say, yeah, the world is just a bad place and there's no hope and people are unredeemable. So when I rejected that, it was this almost a kind of moment of like ecstasy. It was probably one of the more extreme moments of like beauty, of feeling this communion with the divine, of almost being able to see like, eons of time stretched out before my eyes, and seeing that this sort of the story of the lives that populate the world are enormously rich and varied, and yes, probably characterized mostly by sin and error and ignorance and stumbling along, and yet there is a beauty to it, and it is fully redeemed by the little bit of good that remains in people. By that, there's little moments when they actually reach out to that hand that is extended toward them and seek after grace, right? So that was I don't know how we got onto that, but that was my digression into Girard. Have you read read Brothers Karamazov?
No, there's another one I need to. I'm
Um,
not doing well with my fiction. I need to do better with my fiction.
we can revert to Burke and Tocqueville if you
Fair
wish.
enough.
But there's this beautiful moment, like the best character, one of my favorite characters in literature is in Brothers Karamazov, in which he like falls to the earth and it just kisses the ground, and it's being overcome by the sense of the beauty of life and of creation. And it was it was that moment. So it's certainly it's a spiritual struggle, and there are moments of insight and moments when I feel like I've done well. There's also moments of like really profound perplexity and of not doing so well. So yeah.
Hearing you talk reminds me, and you state this so beautifully, about Roger Scruton talking about the loss of loss, if you will, right? The inability to countenance loss. We have to make light of things. We have to flee from it. And that has not historically been the West's response to loss. It's to embrace it for what it is. It's a sanctifying experience. And by loss, I'm not trying to make light of it. I mean, we're describing here suffering, deep, profound suffering, that beauty and I think humanity comes out of it. Can also, a lot of evil can come out of it, right? But it's something that I want, and I'm not trying to just wet it so narrow a lane, but I'll say again, a Burkean conservative, I think part of the mission there is to recapture the magic of reality, that it's not just this purely secular, dry existence that at the end leaves us sort of, maybe the only response you can have in that moment is stoicism. And thank God for those who can do it. But a good many people, I think, need something more to rekindle the magic of this reality. And you had mentioned the little bit I do know of Girard is how he leans so heavily on religious imageries. I don't know if this is from him, but I would be shocked if it wasn't, because the earliest form of scapegoat I'm aware of in literature is not the Soviet Union. It's from, I believe it's Leviticus. It is where God himself tells the people of Israel to have a literal scapegoat, right? That you'll cast your dispersions and sins upon. And this mechanism that we see used with such evil pernicians in the Soviet Union and in communist China, and I don't want to say, the evil's still there, but maybe the institutional ability to do as much harm is lessened here in the West, is deeply human and deeply ancient. And I'm curious though, because I wanted to spend some time talking to you about, I guess what I'll term competing notions of justice. because there's something going on here in humanity, right? I mean, God himself sets up a certain system in which he says you cast your dispersions here. Now, maybe one could argue, yeah, but that's God. God himself says worship me. It's not okay for a human to do that. It's okay for God to do it because he's God. There are some things that he, I don't want to say gets away with, but it's such a category error between ourselves and the divine that, it's not a fair comparison. But what is so, well, I tell you what, I don't want to, I don't want to leave the jury too much, if you will. I'll sort of leave it here. What is your broader understanding of, if you will, justice in the sense that how you might see it and how it would differ, say, from those who would engage in a cancel culture spirit? Because if we took just a moment to sort of stillman their argument, say, they appear to be seeking out some sort of good. They appear to be trying to right some perceived wrong. Even, and I don't mean that as justification for what they're doing, but rather it's not. I rarely see individuals who engage in behaviors solely because they believe it to be evil. Right, most of the time they're trying to do something that they themselves feel is righteous. So, can you speak to that? What is our misconstrued, if you will, sense of justice that can be leading some individuals to engage in this sort of mob mentality?
Yeah. Um, so I would go back to Plato because I love Plato and everything is in Plato. And he, the I think challenges that we're encountering today are not novel. They're not unique to us, and we're not the first to have navigated them. So much of Plato's project, and this comes out most prominently in the Gorgias and the Republic, is about rectifying our understanding of what justice is. And he had encountered, and in these dialogues, he refutes a number of misapprehensions about the nature of justice. One of them being that justice is basically a kind of necessary evil needed to preserve social peace. So it's not a good in itself, but basically we submit to justice because we don't want other people to commit injustice against us, and that's it. So we submit to laws that say you can't steal because you don't want people to steal your things. But the critical thing there is there's not an idea that justice exists as a sort of immutable, eternal quality. It's not a standard that is out there somewhere against which we should evaluate our behavior. It's basically just sort of a thing that binds us as part of living in a society. And the assumption is that for most people, if they were to stumble upon a ring of Gyges that made them invisible, such that they could do wrong and suffer no punishment.
Sorry, is that another Lord of the Rings reference?
It's not. It's the other way around. I think Tolkien was probably riffing on the Republic here. So
Oh,
the Ring
okay.
of Gyges, there's this like complicated story about the Ring of Gyges. It had something to, it's buried underground. I think there's a horse involved. I don't know. Anyway,
I fancy
makes
myself to be a well-read person, but so far in this conversation, I'm like, I have got to go back to the drawing board.
it makes you invisible. You can do all sorts of like evil and pernicious things and you will suffer no consequence and you can't be held accountable. And the assumption in the Republic is that surely most people would do that then if they can get away with it, right? There's no reason not to do that if you can get away with it. So Socrates' position in the dialogue is that actually no, justice is a good in itself. It's not an instrumental means to an end or something. It's not something to be kind of wielded or weaponized for your advantage. It's a good in itself. It exists as one of the forms of the good that is sort of transcendent, immutable, eternal, and it provides us with the standard against which we should judge our own actions and those of others, even of the state. And that living in accordance with justice is good for us in this life and in the next. So, to test this idea, his interlocutors in this discussion kind of put forward a scenario and say, all right, let's imagine two men. One is actually deeply unjust in his soul, and yet he is thought by everyone to be a paragon of virtue. He's wealthy, he has all the resources he needs to make like lavish offerings to the gods and win their favor, but he's actually quite rotten in his soul. Contrast that with an actually righteous person who is thought by everyone and treated like a villain, someone who lives in poverty and ignominy and ends up being tortured and even crucified. Who is the happier of the two? And the reason you needed such an extreme situation is to say, so that you could say that the second person, any happiness, certainly can't derive from any worldly goods or pleasures, right? So you have to strip him of all goods in order for the contrast to really work. And so Socrates makes the argument that actually it's the just man who is happier, even in this life, because he has a well-ordered soul. And that's really the source of happiness. But here and in several other dialogues, Plato also elaborates a vision of the afterlife. And it's always a little different, but there are very similar connective themes. And the basic idea that he's describing is that more so than in this world, in the next world, the scales do balance, and the just and the righteous have their reward, and the unjust are seen clearly for what they are. And will meet their punishment that is due to them. So they'll be sort of stripped of all of their earthly garments and titles and false appearances, and will be judged in full naked transparency. And so this is kind of the final reason that he offers as to why we should endeavor to live justly. And one of the things that's striking about that is, the idea of the afterlife and the idea that there is a transcendent standard of justice that exists independent of time or human opinion, those things seem to me necessary in order to actually take the approach that Socrates or that Plato here is advancing. If you don't believe that there is an external kind of transcendent standard of justice, then justice is really just whatever power says it is, and everything just becomes a contest to try to obtain power so that you get to be the one who metes out justice, right? And if you don't believe in an afterlife, well, that has its own consequences. I think it can produce. Hannah Arendt describes this in The Origins of Totalitarianism. She talks about how the loss of this belief in an afterlife where there is ultimate justice can produce in some people a kind of radical urgency to try to achieve perfect justice in this world. If this is all we have, I think some people then are moved to say, well, then we need to right all wrongs, right? We need to uplift the victims, the people who suffer, the poor. We need to kind of turn the scales in this world and achieve a kind of social salvation, rather than the idea of salvation as being something that lies beyond this world, through grace after death or whatever. So I think there's two ways in which the loss of those types of beliefs translates into a real confusion about what justice looks like. On the one hand, it's this sort of radical attempt to immanentize the eschaton, to use Buckley's phrase, to bring heaven down into earth and correct all wrongs. But we can't really do that because, we have very limited wisdom, insight, right? We can't actually see things as they really are. Or it leads to the situation where you think you can get away with anything. There's no standard above you that's going to judge you. Everything is actually just a matter of obtaining power so that you get to be the one who decides.
Yeah, and I think both of those views are on full display in various, I'll say, radical political ideologies within the West. We've been, and I'm sure it predates this, but at least in the modern era, we in the West have been having this big argument ever since the French Revolution. To what degree can we actually put the world in some sort of order? And I sort of started it with the notion that I think is true, that oftentimes even the most radical cancel culture, social justice warrior, if you will, is pursuing some ideal of the good, or at least what they would. It may be distorted, it may be wrong, but they have some sense in mind of what the world ought to be. And I like how you put it. That sort of, it's difficult because I'm of the opinion that it is not required that individuals embrace, or let me put it this way. I can make partnership with my secular, materialistic, classical liberal pals who are trying to keep a sort of system going where we have an equal playing field and we're not just killing each other. In fact, I see them in a lot of ways as my political allies oftentimes. while at the same time recognizing that that sort of secular stagnation, I think, is what's allowing for the radicalization of these ideologies. Now, I don't think it's like a 1-to-1 ratio, for every ounce of magic we bring back into the world somehow that makes us less susceptible, if you will. But it's more in totality. And so oftentimes I feel like I'm working on two projects simultaneously, right? One is to, okay, well, where are you at right now? Let's have a conversation to maybe take out the rough edges around your radicalism, so maybe we can agree on some, again, lowercase classical liberal projects or institutions. But also, how do I speak to you in a manner that touches you as a human? And gives you an alternative, because I think that's what is from the movie The Big Lebowski. Say what you will about National Socialism, at least it's an ethos. Say what you will about these radical ideologies, at least it's something for the soul to feed off of, if you will, even if it's a sugar high and not really something that you actually need or would be sustaining or redeeming. I want to acknowledge that those individuals see the world and they see injustice and they say, well, what do we do about this? And I've often, it's often been a curiosity to me that there's probably a better word for this, but I'm going to call it the lack of curiosity, say, of how exactly is it that if I got online and railed against Caylan Ford, I'm somehow making this world a better place. Like it's like from 1,000-foot view, I kind of get it, right? Caylan Ford's a white nationalist. We need to make sure that she has no avenue in society that sees her as a legitimate force in any degree. I don't know if the point is so much they're trying to extract pain for you, but it's at least like, well, of course we don't want Nazis working for us, sort of thing. We have no place for that. And so I understand from an extreme abstract level why a person could say, I'm doing some good, say, doing this. So what is it that, I don't know if it would be just a lack of curiosity, but like, what is it that makes it so hard for a person to say, but Caylan Ford is an actual human being? And should we not at least invest some energy into determining, are we right about these claims before we just sort of charge out here on this sort of mission to change the world?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. A few different threads. I mean, one, you described this as a sugar high. And I think that's a good description. And one maybe criteria that could be used to separate, I think, legitimate from maybe misguided moral crusades or causes is to say, well, in seeking to better the world, does it demand that you first better yourself? Or does it tell you that you will be a good person no matter what you do, as long as you're standing on the right side of some social political issue? When you first make demands on the individual and you say, no, you need to set your own heart and mind in order, you need to achieve justice within yourself, you need to cultivate your faculties of intellectual and moral and ethical discernment. That's hard to do. If you tell people, no, you need to practice actual tolerance, for people you disagree with, you need to practice equanimity, forgiveness, charity, magnanimity, like that's hard. The sort of flatterers who I think are kind of prominent within these ideological movements will say, no, you don't have to do any of that hard inner work. You just have to take our side on social issues. And, the more you stand at the vanguard and push to the extremes, and the more you seek to, purify the ranks of society or the people on the wrong side, the better the person you'll be. So it's a very reductionist, kind of quasi-Manichaean worldview that says there's black and there's white, there's good and there's evil. We're the good guys if we're standing on the right side of the issue. The measure of right and wrong is sort of basically the changeable whims of politics. It's not a transcendent standard. It's not an eternal standard. Right and wrong is just, what is sort of fashionable opinion. So, if a social movement is asking you to make yourself a better person by doing inner work, I think that's probably a good sign, as opposed to saying, no, you can be a good person just by like joining our revolution, and punishing the bad people. As to sort of what is some of the deeper worldview and motives, I tried often to engage with my critics, to ask them what they were hoping to achieve, why they were saying or doing the things about me that they were doing, to offer to have a conversation with them, because I thought some of them may have been legitimately distressed or hurt or confused by the things that they had read. And so I wanted to assuage any pain that they might have been feeling. Because I think actually it is actually not a very pleasant experience to be told that you're hated. And so, I wanted to let them know I don't hate them. I don't hate anyone on the basis of race or ethnicity or whatever. So I would, if people were sometimes calling me a white supremacist or trying to get me fired from more jobs or whatever, I would try to start private message conversations with them and offer to have this dialogue and say, look, I'll tell you what I actually believe. If you think I'm in error about anything, I would like to know. I would like to know so that I can correct the error. So here's what I think. Here's why I think this. And I found two things. One, most people, as soon as the performative dimension was removed, that is, as soon as it became a private conversation rather than a public display, they kind of lost interest. I mean, the point of the performance is just to show your peers that you are the vanguard of ideological purity and you're prosecuting even these very border cases of social transgression. So most people lost interest immediately. The few people who did engage, I found, were seemingly incapable of dialectical dialogue, utterly incurious. But one of them was very candid. He said, after we shared a little bit, he said, okay, all the things you're saying are probably true, but the world shouldn't be like that. And I thought that was very revealing. So it was as if he thought, if we just stop people from observing or discussing what is true, maybe we will create the room for a different kind of world to take root and to flourish. And I realized too that I think one of the challenges that we have at a societal level is we have lost the shared moral symbols and sort of the shared real first principles that would allow us to actually adjudicate moral disputes in a coherent way. One of the main things being, like when you're engaged in, let's say, an academic or an intellectual debate, your two sides might clash. Through that process, hopefully you kind of get closer to the truth. The idea of getting closer to the truth is held to be the goal. This is part of just sort of the unspoken rules of intellectual engagement, that you're trying to get at the truth. And you do that because at some level you believe that there is a unity of truth and goodness. You think truth is good. So you and your interlocutor, although you disagree, both want to reach the truth. Both of you are aiming toward that same good. You might disagree about how to get there, but you agree on the fundamentals that truth is good, and that should be your aim. If you have certain people who don't believe that truth or that reality is good, the rules of engagement fall apart. And I think that's one of the things that we're dealing with, is that there are people who think that reality is disordered, is bad, is unfair. And so their goal is not to try to orient themselves toward what is true. It is to overthrow what is true. Those are fundamentally different aims, and they can't possibly be compatible. Have you read Eric Voegelin?
I'm very familiar with Eric Voegelin, and I've not yet read him.
Science, Politics, and Gnosticism is a very good primer. It's pretty short. It'll make you feel dumb, but it's really good. Voegelin was a scholar of totalitarianism. He was a refugee from from Nazism in Austria, fled to the United States, and dedicated his life to trying to understand the problem of political and philosophical disorder. And he's just a tremendous person to hang out with, in the form of his books. He diagnosed a lot of modern ideological movements, including liberalism, positivism, National Socialism, socialism, communism, as being expressions of a sort of modern Gnosticism. And we can set aside, for example, why he chose Gnosticism as the label, but he kind of contrasts these ideological movements with true philosophy. And he says that philosophy is man's loving endeavor to apprehend the order of being and to attune his soul to it. That is, we love reality, Philosophy is an almost kind of erotic act in the true sense, right? It's the love of wisdom. It's not a claim to possess wisdom, but it's an orientation toward it. It's a loving orientation toward reality, toward the truth, and then an attempt to conform our own soul with it, to live in harmony with reality, which we view as like actually something that's quite extraordinary and beautiful and enchanted. Whereas the objective of so many of these ideological movements is they think reality is fundamentally disordered, and that if only they can seize power, they can use their knowledge, hence gnosis, to reorder it, to create a perfect society, to eliminate the suffering, the injustice, the sense of unease that we experience as human beings. So these are just fundamentally different orientations toward reality. And I think that makes it very difficult to have real dialogue with people who don't share the sort of the basic principle of the unity of truth and of goodness.
And again, I will say it is not necessary to have a view of the divine or a theistic notion, I think, to orient yourself towards a healthier politics. But it's easier to do so when you have a sense of God's providence, right? That there is an eternal plan, it's easier to fall into the Gnostic trap when you presume that this is a universe of disorder, to lack the kind of humility to say, well, wait a minute, maybe I'm part of that disorder. Maybe I ought not to try to change the universe, which seems to me so self-evidently true that I don't understand why individuals keep, it's why we keep trying the same social experiments over and over. Like, why would we know how to do it this time?
Yeah. So I mean, look, there's a fantastic essay in the Vogelin volume that I mentioned called "The Murder of God," and one of the qualities that characterizes this Gnostic mindset, and here I'm using Vogelin's term, I'm not referring to like the ancient heresy, is okay, first they're dissatisfied with the state of the world, which is quite an understandable view, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot that's
I
wrong
am
with the
too.
world, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a fallen world, like, yeah, I get it.
I think complaining about the world is the most common pastime of any group of people that get together.
All right, so we're all kind of dissatisfied with the state of the world. But where the divergence really starts to become apparent is that whereas many of us, I think people who hold maybe more traditional philosophical or religious orientations, would say that this disorder is a function of the kind of beings that we are. It's intrinsic to us and then manifests outwardly. But we are fallen, sinful, we commit karma, we're alienated from the Tao, whatever it may be. It's something in us. And we are thrown here into a state of ignorance, of suffering because of that. Whereas the kind of Gnostic ideologue will completely absolve individual humans of responsibility for this, and will say, no, it's really just, it's totally extrinsic to us. It's the creation, it's creation itself, it's the order of the world that is disordered. And for some reason, there's a logical leap here. For some reason, we can fix it. So it's setting man apart from creation and above creation, and saying, no, we can, through our mastery of techne or whatever it is, we can achieve the perfect organization of the world. We just need power, and we need to, liquidate the people who get in the way of our project. One of the things that Vogelin identifies is that in order for this project to seem to make sense, to bridge that pretty massive logical leap that occurs, it requires the denial of the transcendent source of being. Right? You have to reject the idea that creation is kind of a gift that is given to us, that comes from above, from some divine force, and you have to then make it something that is under the dominion of man. So it necessitates, in Vogelin's words, it necessitates the decapitation of God. And when you lose that transcendent source of creation, you lose with it the idea that there's any transcendent moral law. So there's nothing to bind you in this project. So this is part of the way that Vogelin diagnoses totalitarianism, is the totalitarian has entered into a secondary reality in which they are completely unbound by any moral standard, by any principle of justice. Their whole project is to achieve power so that they can reorder the world according to their designs. And they're justified in doing so because they have decapitated God. They have denied the transcendent.
Yeah, it echoes of C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, or I think G.K. Chesterton even talked about in this modern era we have individuals trying to deny that we have a sin nature, which is the only part he thought of Christianity that was demonstrably proven. It's interesting, the hubris, I think, that we humans are capable of trying to set the world right. I mean, this runs through. I don't want to just make it political, but it runs throughout so much of leftist ideology. You know, the famous Marx philosophers have explained. I can't remember the exact phrase, but have explained reality. Now it's up to us to change it, or something to that
Yes,
effect.
the philosophers have hitherto only sought to describe reality. The point is to change it, right? That's
Yeah.
exactly it. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's an absolutely like diabolical kind of Promethean quest to become gods, not in the sense of attuning ourselves to what is divine and transcendent and kind of joining and participating in it, but to become gods by replacing gods.
Right. Man, I could talk to you all day long, but we probably should wrap up here. I think I was guilty there at the end as the host of we got off the path of the original council culture, but it was all good, and I think it
I
all
think we did. I think
yeah.
this is totally all part of it. Yeah.
Well, yes, I think the threads. I think it's threaded together. It just may require a little bit more squinting there at the end. But I'm going to have you back because there's so much more we haven't talked about. I'm probably going to have to do a lot more reading before I do that, so it won't be quite as embarrassed about what I haven't caught up with yet. But
We can talk, let's talk education, Burke and Tocqueville next time.
There we go. I'm a little bit more in my element in those topics. But Caylan Ford, thank you so much. I do want to give you an opportunity if there's any place you want to direct the guest. If they're like, hey, I kind of like what she has to say, I want to learn more about it. Do you have any website or any work? I know there's a documentary about your experience out there. How would the listener learn about these things?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, caylanford.com or .ca, either works, and you can view some of the documentary films that I've made, one of which deals with, kind of horrifyingly, it's like autobiographical documentary about my experience of cancel culture. It's also a bit of an attempt to affirm the Socratic position in Plato's Gorgias dialogue. That's how I like to dress it up intellectually, so that I can escape the horror of having made a documentary about myself. I'm like sort of semi-active on Twitter or X, so you can find me there as well.
Awesome. Caylan, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.